Those that were living did their best to survive in that mad world of death, blood, and fire. And for 7 long weeks I kept myself alive, whilst the corpses around me grew higher. Then a mujahid knocked me ass over tits, and when I awoke in my hospital bed and saw what it had done, Christ, I wish I were dead. Never knew there were worse things than dying. Hello everyone, my name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary. This is a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. If you didn't catch the last video, as a refresher, I saw not one but 2 movies this past weekend, reviewing them both as part of a double feature review. We already had our say about the lukewarm vigilante espionage flop that was The Amateur, and we are ready to move on to a far more interesting, but no less frustrating second half of our personal double bill of new releases, that of course being the war action film Warfare. Now, for many a cineast, the primary pedigree attached to Warfare is going to be that it's co-directed and co-written by one Alex Garland, the same Alex Garland who came to prominence all the way back in the late 90s as a novelist, the adaptation of his breakthrough The Beach in 2000, eventually leading to a series of collaborations with that film's director Danny Boyle, including 28 Days Later and Sunshine, for which he wrote the original screenplays, also later penning an adaptation of Kazuo Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go, before producing, writing, and effectively co-directing at least the 2012 cult favorite Dread, before striking off on his own officially in earnest as a writer-director with such projects as Ex Machina, Annihilation, Men, and of course last year's Civil War. Basically being a pioneer of postmodern fantasy that is himself virtually synonymous with the 2010s trend of middle-brow films that straddle the line between conventional horror and sci-fi, and a more narratively and visually experimental type of art house cinema. Except that while I certainly made perhaps the mistake of interpreting this new film Warfare too much through the lens of Garland's more personal oeuvre, since Civil War, Garland himself has talked candidly about his desire to retire, at least for now, from directing to refocus on producing and writing, with Warfare itself actually effectively working as a transitional project for him, where his primary disposition has been to support the breakthrough and emergence of another filmmaker, in this case the primary director and writer of Warfare, which is ex-US Navy SEAL and Iraq War veteran Ray Mendoza. Mendoza himself has primarily served as a military and technical advisor on feature films, including Act of Valor from 2012, Lone Survivor in 2013, and most recently, Alex Garland's Civil War. I guess with Garland and Mendoza now basically switching places, the former offering a very different kind of creative and technical advice, Warfare is presented as basically a cinematic memoir, recounting in real time the experiences of Mendoza and his platoon near the tail end of the Second Battle of Ramadi in November of 2006. Warfare devotes pretty much zero energy to the contextualization of either the Second Battle of Ramadi or the Iraq War more broadly. What we are treated to is instead largely a beat-for-beat recounting of how this group of Navy SEALs, under cover of night, captured an Iraqi home, used it as a strategic outpost to monitor insurgent activity, only for their position to be exposed, and rather quickly it seems, and thus leading to these guys being pinned down, 2 of their men being seriously injured, to say nothing of the cruel fate of one of their Iraqi translators, and desperately awaiting evac as what, again, transpires over a period of less than 2 hours, stretches into a discombobulated, sweaty, and screaming eternity. It really is fitting that Mendoza is making his debut as a writer-director with this project after previously making his debut as a military technical advisor with something like Act of Valor, of all things. A movie that was touted back at its release because it was a war action movie that employed actual active duty Navy SEALs in what proved to largely be the most distilled kind of idolatrous homage to the military operator. The elite soldier defending American interests at home and abroad and at the highest price to their lives. The main thing about Warfare is that while on the one hand, it is such a technically minded project with basically no exposition, and I mean no exposition in terms of historical context or plot or even character exposition, no extraneous dialogue except for brief offhanded exchanges that you get a distinct sense, comes from pictures forever frozen in the minds of all the real-life persons who contributed their memories to Mendoza's own reconstruction, and even to the extent that it conveys the emotional subjectivity of these SEALs, especially in instances of direct violence or trauma they sustain, not just physical injury, but the rather immediate effects of, say, shell shock when you find yourself somehow still alive and breathing after an improvised explosive device went off right next to you. There's no getting around that Warfare is selling itself upon its technical precision in spite of its being constructed both from probably rigorously documented military records, as well as from memories and impressions by those involved. But at the same time, when one immediately contrasts Warfare with not only movies like Act of Valor and Lone Survivor, movies that Mendoza himself has worked on as a technical advisor, the main thing that strikes home is that Mendoza's memoir film plays as the exact opposite of what has become fairly dubbed to be operator porn. You know, operator porn, right? That unique genre of American war and action cinema that not only exalts in the halcyon tradition of venerating our armed forces in general, regardless of whether or not the cause to which those forces are committed to is necessarily just or even logical from a defense or peacekeeping perspective, and citations definitely needed with the Iraq War. Not just the veneration of the troops, though, not just the support our troops sloganeering and general propaganda, but specifically the valorization of the operator, the elite soldier who comes to embody the supposed exceptional qualities of American military prestige in its most exalting, technically masterful, and ruthless form, with Navy SEALs themselves obviously being a now classic build for that archetype. In the typical operator porn, no matter how down the chips may be, that only proves a fulcrum for defining the infinite malleability of the operator as a perfect instrument of American ideals and the projection of our supposed power and mastery, not even just over the rest of the world, but over the very definition of what is just or unjust, who the good guys are and who are the bad, who are the allies in our fight for global prosperity led by us, and who are the targets who need to be neutralized, and of course all tied up with the bow that direct civilian casualties due to the actions of the operator are virtually non-existent in operator porn. The elite warrior can only be martyred, can only be so incredibly devoted to his country and its ideals that the primary dramatic victim of his violence is always himself, not any pre-calculated expendables who just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Warfare, however, doesn't treat its subjects like this almost at all. Our first introduction to these guys is with them amping themselves up by, of all things, watching the lurid music video to the Eric Pride's produced house single Call on Me. And with seemingly more dramatic inspiration derived from a movie like Jarhead than from any of the projects Mendoza has previously worked on, much of the first half hour of the film is devoted simply to the edgy, frustrated waiting of these guys as they mostly just take and relay notes, only to realize way too late that the very potential insurgents they are marking have also, without any of the same technical wizardry or supposedly elite training, marked them. Don't get me wrong, when the shit goes down, there's definitely some moments of inspired bravery and resolve exhibited by these guys, But for the most part, Mendoza portrays his troops' experiences as the most frank kind of confrontation with the bald-faced lie of operator porn. These guys are not elite warriors. They are just another facet of a much larger, and from their own perspective, basically so massive as to be totally obscure. They are just one facet of this larger organization of men with their own specialties, their own directives, their own specialized tools, none of which seems to matter in particular when the shooting finally reaches them. Warfare might not bother to do much historical contextualization of this story, which is its own can of discourse, especially when one accounts for audiences who are maybe too young to remember, as I do, the entire arc of the invasion and occupation of Iraq as, like, this saga of American bloodlust in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks in 2001, being pursued by the Bush administration under false pretenses of some direct strategic connection between 9/11 and the government of Saddam Hussein, and all sort of turning into this one long, drawn-out, cruel embarrassment to many Americans of my generation's basic sense of their country as somehow a moral actor on the global stage, and not just a rogue powerhouse that does whatever it wants, regardless of how many lives it destroys or dominoes it sets falling in an escalating disaster of war and surveillance and the broader militarization of U.S. society itself. Warfare doesn't bother giving us that context, but in a way that is arguably comparable to how Oliver Stone, as a Vietnam veteran, contributed so much more to the cinematic presentation of the Vietnam War with Platoon than so many filmmakers who were primarily relating to that war as a faraway stain and not a directly felt experience of the sheer repulsiveness of America's interventions in the world abroad under the banner of security and freedom. Warfare becomes like Platoon of the now interminably long post-9/11 era. It becomes a cinematic statement that attempts or alleges to accurately present the experiences of this one platoon of Navy SEALs, this echelon of elite warriors, as so much of the rest of our media tells us they are, including, to say the least, direct propaganda from the military, often working increasingly in concert with major Hollywood filmmakers. And to then present it for the unpredictable, chaotic, deathly, painful, morally murky thing that it is. And while some would argue, and not unfairly, that Warfare is not so much an anti-operator porn as it is revisionist operator porn, that it still fundamentally betrays the preoccupation of American filmmakers with telling a status quo narrative primarily focused, again, on the martyr-like suffering of our boys rather than, all the Iraqis who are not just being killed, but like having their homes straight up broken into in the middle of the night and held at gunpoint in a single room for hours, as those same people basically draw the firefight on top of their heads as well. You could very reasonably argue that Warfare is only revising the cliches of operator porn in the same way that most of the so-called revisionist westerns from the late 50s through the 70s didn't really revision much in the way of, say, the Central American myth of manifest destiny, the categorical inevitability of what America is and is doing. Except that the thing that really keeps the glue of Mendoza's film clinging together will be these moments in which he, say, inserts a close-up of one of the SEALs' Iraqi hostages. I'm sorry, that's what they are. They're hostages. Inserting a close-up of their own terror, their own edginess, their own discombobulation. These moments are brief, but just like with the offhanded bits of dialogue, there is this sense in the memoir fashion of Warfare that Mendoza is specifically lacing these moments into the film as a way of consciously reframing the focus of the story so that, ironically, this Iraq war veteran and ex-Navy SEAL has made for his debut a revisionist operator porn movie, at least, that is far more soberly, implicitly critical of its primary military subjects, the elite operator himself and his comrades, and what they are doing there, and the effect that it has on these other people. what their objective is, what kind of trauma it brings to these innocent people, and not just how it directly affected them as the soldiers, as the belligerents who knew what they were getting into. These moments are not by any means extensive, and I'll be honest, as I alluded to in my review of The Amateur, as I was teeing Warfare up, I think I find myself particularly frustrated by this film because to the extent that it honestly has to do so little in order to push films made about America's still quite recent military history, to do so little to push them so far out and away from what other filmmakers without direct experience have even broached achieving in terms of actually making a movie that is so personal to the experiences of the armed forces people involved, but also, again, with so little actually proving far less navel-gazing and even US-centric in its dramatic scope and perspective, that it is far more earnest seeming, at least in its presentation of the subjectivity and the suffering of those who do not represent, and in some senses, even within the context of how Mendoza presents this story, without them being belligerents, without them being enemies, they are like these living, subjective manifestations of everything that these characters, no matter how devoted they are to their patriotism, no matter how much they believe in the military as an entity and its importance to our country and its ideals, an acknowledgement of the fact that they are causing harm to people who will only ever internalize them as an opposition to them, as a force that is bringing destruction or terror into their lives. But it's also a double-edged sword of like, yes, this is how far we can go. Really, this is it. We can get a few brief, disturbing cutaways of this family being held hostage, only the disturbing inference that, oh, right, a lot of innocent people suffered gravely as a direct consequence of our collective political actions. That's only as far as we can get, with just these disturbing inferences, not actually a normalizing perspective of what we should think of when we think, like, the casualties of the Iraq War. In the interminably apocalyptically long post-9/11 era, for both affirmative and pessimistic reasons, I really hope something like Warfare can be considered the last post-9/11 film. The late-term nail in the coffin of a cycle of films primarily composed of crybaby liberal agitprop detritus on the one hand, and again, pornographic adulation of American power and sacrifice for its own vainglorious sake. So finally, we've gotten a film that does something actually dramatically bold, like showing the two new Iraqi army translators hitched to these Navy SEALs being told, hey, you're going first on this evac, and them being like to each other, are these guys using us as human shields? And honestly, Mendoza doesn't really seem to skirt the issue. This film very much presents these traditional archetypes of the elite warriors as like, yep, in a situation like this, you do it by the book, and right now, by the book means you send the Iraqi translators first into the line of fire. There are tiers as far as who we are told are the most important people in this operation and who has to do the dirtiest work of all. It's really up how deadpan and procedural Mendoza is about how this stuff actually works in a way that is totally unalloyed and seemingly absolutely disinterested in much of anything that presents what a Navy SEAL is or does as anything more than a series of procedures, as anything that even has a moral or heroic dimension to it. Again, there are some heroics, some bending the rules to get the job done, but then you remember that the job getting done is just rescuing these guys who were sent down into this pocket of insurgency to do what? To watch people? Like, literally, yeah, that guy looks like he might be an insurgent. Yeah, that guy too. Yeah, there's even more of them now. And now they're using the call to prayer to send the civilians away. and now we need to get the out of here because they know where we are. We're trapped like rats, and they will not stop until we're all dead or gone. Very frustrating, you know, because the most irresponsible thing about warfare, that lack of historical context, is also so crucial to what makes it truly artistically exceptional in a way where so many post 9/11 films are simply, again, navel-gazing martyr complex ballads or outright fascist propaganda about the elite warriors. There is this sense of overall discombobulation to the film, where on the one hand, again, it can literally only go so far in reframing or revisioning the new American war action propaganda, but then the final shot of this movie will almost make you feel reverberations of Jonathan Glazer's The Zone of Interest, where you think somehow you are seeing down this bleak, dark tunnel of deep history and perceiving, in the vision of a former operator themselves, just a flagrant sin and injustice that goes beyond the anecdotal memoirs of the film's primary subjects. You really do get this sense that either Mendoza is fully realizing, or Garland, as assistant director and co-writer, is helping to facilitate a clearer vision of an Iraq War film, in that it actually feels like it's about the Iraq War, not just what it does to soldiers in terms of the belligerency and combat, but what it makes them into in ways that are not over the top, are not evil, are not easily compartmentalized as just bad apples spoiling the bunch, but just this demeaning procedure that just trickles down from there in terms of the sewage that it just washes everything with. This is the first Iraq War film that actually feels like it's about the Iraq War specifically, and is not just trying to compartmentalize and rationalize it. Warfare, it's daring, frustrating, hypnotic, shackled to inevitable sets of disappointments as it can push the needle, but only so far. I don't know that I can even necessarily say that I liked it. But it's not really a movie that's made to be liked. And unlike previous films like Longlegs and The Brutalist, where I made that special caveat that this is a film to be engaged with for the artistic challenge of it, and not necessarily because you're going to get into it or it's going to be easily accessible. Unlike those films, I will say that Warfare is a stunning enough debut for Mendoza, a very effective and fine-tuned attempt to do for war and action movies what Garland in his long career has already done for horror and science fiction, bringing enough of that experimental finesse, if only to prove, hey, turns out that these supposedly elevated and experimental takes on established genres are pretty accessible, get us engaged even when we feel conflicted, in my case politically, about the film itself, and how I just think it's literally systematically incapable of going far enough. Again, I hope that this is the last post 9/11 film. No more rumination or litigation after this. If Warfare is as well made technically as it is, and even has so many dramatic and artistic points in its favor, and is still fundamentally a failure to the sheer scope of how awful the invasion and occupation of Iraq was as a national project, I am more than happy to say post 9/11 cinema has failed. We have failed in all this time to produce anything that can hold our feet to the fire like it should. My hang-ups prevent me from claiming I liked or even really endorse it. But I can't deny that even by that conflicted standard of this is a creative piece intended more to provocation than to entertainment, even by that standard, I have to acknowledge some deftly fine craftsmanship coming out of Mendoza's debut and Garland's collaboration on it. I'm giving Warfare a conflicted 3.5 out of 5. With that, I'm going to get out of here. Thank you so much for sticking through this whole video. Please don't be a stranger to the comments. What did I get right? What did I get wrong? Otherwise, please share, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the new movie diary. I'm going to catch you guys next time.